The most dangerous lie isn't the one strangers tell about you. It's the one the people you love choose to believe. The Whitmore estate had always been built for spectacle. On warm spring nights like this one, the glass walls of the ballroom reflected the soft gold glow of hundreds of lights, making the place feel less like a home and more like a stage. Crystal chandeliers hovered above the marble floor like frozen stars, and the quiet hum of conversation drifted through the room, as if everyone already understood they were part of something important. Wealth had a sound. It was the clink of champagne flutes, the polished laughter of investors who had never worried about rent, the careful footsteps of staff moving silently along the walls. And tonight, every one of those sounds circled around the same family name. Whitmore. Daniel Whitmore stood near the center of the room, tall and composed in a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been tailored directly onto his shoulders. At 36, he had already built a reputation that traveled faster than any headline. CEO of Whitmore Capital, Forbes interviews, tech acquisitions that reshaped entire industries. But standing there among the city's wealthiest guests, Daniel didn't look like a man thinking about markets or strategy. His attention kept drifting to the woman beside him. Alana Brooks didn't belong to the world of boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations, but somehow she made the entire room feel quieter simply by standing still. Her dress was simple compared to the diamonds flashing around the ballroom, a deep emerald fabric that moved softly as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She didn't try to compete with the spectacle. She didn't need to. There was a calm confidence in the way she held herself, the kind that didn't come from wealth but from knowing exactly who you were. Daniel noticed the way people looked at her. Some curious, some skeptical, and some openly calculating. The Whitmore name attracted attention the way light attracted moths, and anyone standing close to that name became part of the spotlight whether they wanted it or not. Across the room, Margaret Whitmore watched everything. Daniel's mother had spent decades mastering the art of observation. She stood near the long dining table set with silver trays and white orchids, her posture straight, her pearl necklace resting perfectly against the collar of her cream silk blouse. She looked like the portrait of a woman who had never lost control of a room. But her eyes were sharp tonight, moving from guest to guest before settling once again on Alana. If anyone had asked Margaret Whitmore what she thought of her son's relationship, she would have smiled politely and said the right things. She had always known the right things to say in public. But the truth lived somewhere else entirely, tucked behind the quiet tightening of her jaw whenever Alana's name appeared in conversation. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne glasses. Daniel took one and handed it to Alana, brushing her fingers gently as he did. "You're doing okay?" he asked quietly. She gave a small smile. "It's a little overwhelming." Daniel glanced around the ballroom where more than 100 guests moved through conversations about investments, foundations, and political connections. "They'll calm down in an hour," he said. "This is just the part where everyone pretends they're impressed." Alana laughed softly. "Pretends. Give them time," Daniel said. "They'll find something else to talk about soon." But across the room, Margaret Whitmore had already made her decision. She stepped away from the table with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who understood exactly how attention moved through a room like this. Her heels clicked gently against the marble as she walked toward the center of the ballroom. At first, no one noticed. Then someone did. And when people noticed Margaret Whitmore moving with purpose, conversations had a way of fading without anyone needing to ask for silence. Daniel saw her approaching and straightened slightly. "My mother looks like she's about to make a speech," he said quietly. Alana followed his gaze. Margaret stopped a few feet away, her expression calm, almost thoughtful. But there was something colder behind that calm, something that didn't belong at a celebration. "Daniel," Margaret said gently, her voice carrying just far enough to quiet the nearby conversations. "There's something we need to discuss." The shift in the room was subtle but immediate. Guests who had been chatting near the tall windows turned their attention toward the center of the ballroom. Someone set down a glass a little too quickly. Daniel frowned slightly. "What's wrong?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze toward Alana with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I believe something important has gone missing this evening," she said. The air in the room seemed to tighten around the words. Daniel blinked. "Missing?" Margaret nodded slowly. "A diamond bracelet. It belonged to your grandmother." Several guests exchanged glances. The Whitmore family collection was well known in certain circles, and anything connected to it carried more than just financial value. Daniel glanced toward the table where the jewelry had been displayed earlier in the evening. Are you sure it's not just misplaced? Margaret tilted her head slightly. I thought that at first. She paused just long enough for the silence to deepen. Then she continued, her voice still perfectly controlled. Until it was discovered in someone's purse. The words hung in the air like a crack in glass. Daniel felt the shift before he fully understood it. Guests were no longer pretending to talk among themselves. They were watching. Margaret slowly turned toward Alana. The movement was graceful, almost casual, but the meaning behind it was impossible to ignore. I'm afraid, Margaret said softly, that the bracelet was found in your bag. For a moment, the room didn't breathe. Alana blinked as if the sentence had arrived in a language she didn't recognize. I'm sorry. Margaret's expression didn't change. A staff member stepped forward hesitantly, holding a small velvet pouch. Margaret accepted it and opened the drawstring with careful fingers. Inside, a thin line of diamonds caught the chandelier light and scattered it across the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Daniel stared at the bracelet, then at Alana. That's not possible, he said quietly. Alana looked at him, her voice steady even though her heart had begun to pound against her ribs. Daniel, I've never even seen that before tonight. Margaret closed the pouch and folded her hands together. Then perhaps you can explain why it was inside your purse. Every eye in the ballroom shifted to Alana. The chandeliers above them continued to glow warmly. The music from the string quartet, still drifting through the air, as if the evening hadn't just changed direction completely. Alana felt the weight of 100 strangers watching her. Not curious anymore. Judging. Calculating. Waiting to see what she would do next. She could feel Daniel's gaze on her, searching for something in her expression that would make sense of what had just happened. Alana took a slow breath. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't panic. She simply looked at Margaret Whitmore and said quietly, I didn't take it. Margaret's eyes held hers for a long moment. Then she said something that would echo through the Whitmore family long after the lights of that ballroom went dark. Then someone, Margaret said calmly, must have put it there. And for the first time that night, Daniel Whitmore began to realize that the celebration he thought he was hosting had just become something very different. The silence inside the Whitmore ballroom did not break immediately after Margaret's words. Instead, it spread slowly through the room, like the moment before a storm when everyone senses the air changing, but no one yet knows how severe the weather will become. Conversations that had filled the space only seconds earlier disappeared completely. The soft violin music continued from the quartet in the corner, but even that began to fade as the musicians noticed the tension gathering across the marble floor. Daniel Whitmore stood very still, his eyes moving from the velvet pouch in his mother's hand to the woman beside him. Alana Brooks had not stepped back. She had not raised her voice. She simply stood there, shoulders straight, looking directly at Margaret with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the beginning of the evening. But Daniel could feel the room turning. He could feel the weight of attention pressing toward them from every direction. Guests who had arrived expecting champagne and polite speeches were now witnessing something else entirely. A family dispute among the Whitmores was never small. Margaret closed the pouch slowly and placed it on the table beside her as if she were setting down a piece of evidence in a courtroom. Daniel, she said gently, I believe we should speak privately. Her voice was calm, but the message was unmistakable. The accusation had already been made in front of the room. The damage was already spreading. Daniel hesitated for a moment, glancing at Alana again as if waiting for something that might explain what had just happened. Alana held his gaze. I did not take it, she said quietly. Her tone did not change. She did not plead. She simply repeated the truth the way someone repeats their own name. Daniel inhaled slowly. For years he had built a career on quick decisions and instinct, on the ability to read a room before anyone else realized a deal was shifting. But this was not a boardroom. This was his family. And the woman standing beside him was the person he had spent the last 2 years building a future with. Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that only the nearest guests could hear. The bracelet was found in her purse by one of the staff while preparing the coats, she said. I did not want to believe it either. The way she spoke made the sentence feel heavier, as though disappointment were more painful than anger. Several guests exchanged quiet looks. One woman, near the window, placed a hand against her chest, as if the situation were personally distressing. The power of reputation moved quickly in rooms like this. Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly, his mind trying to catch up with the moment. "Alana," he said carefully, "did you move your purse earlier tonight?" "Yes," she answered. "I left it near the coat check when we arrived." Margaret nodded softly. "Exactly." The single word carried more meaning than the sentence itself. The implications settled over the room before anyone said it aloud. Daniel felt something inside his chest tighten. He had seen the same tactic used in corporate negotiations. A statement that sounded reasonable. A suggestion that left the rest for everyone else to conclude on their own. He looked again at the bracelet glittering faintly through the velvet pouch. It was unmistakable. The Whitmore family heirloom had been photographed countless times in charity events and magazines. There was no doubt about its identity. And yet the image of Alana quietly slipping something into her bag made no sense at all. Alana noticed the hesitation in his eyes. That small shift was harder to face than Margaret's accusation. She had always known the Whitmore name came with complicated expectations. She had known from the beginning that Margaret Whitmore had never fully accepted her presence in Daniel's life. But she had believed that Daniel trusted her. That trust was the only thing that mattered now. She folded her hands together to keep them steady. "Daniel," she said, "please listen to me. I did not take anything from your family." Her voice carried across the room, not loud but clear enough that the guests closest to them could hear every word. The quartet in. The corner had stopped playing entirely now. Even the servers had paused near the walls, unsure whether to continue their quiet routines or step away completely. Margaret sighed softly, a sound that carried both patience and sadness. "No one wishes for this to be true," she said. "But facts are difficult things to ignore." Daniel looked from his mother to Alana again. Two completely different worlds stood in front of him. Margaret Whitmore had raised him alone after his father died. She had built Whitmore Capital from a struggling financial firm into one of the most respected investment companies in the country. Everything Daniel understood about discipline, reputation, and responsibility had come from her. And yet the woman standing beside him was the person who had brought calm into his life in ways success never could. Alana had never asked him for anything. Not the house in Manhattan. Not the connections. Not the influence his name carried. She had simply loved him. The room waited. Finally Daniel spoke again, his voice lower than before. "Everyone," he said quietly, "please give us a moment." The request was polite, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Guests began stepping away in careful silence, creating a widening circle of space around the three of them. The chandeliers above continued to shine with the same elegant glow, but the warmth of the evening had disappeared completely. Daniel turned fully toward Alana now. "Look at me," he said softly. She did. The calm in her expression had not changed. That calm unsettled him more than anything else. If she had panicked, if she had argued or defended herself loudly, the moment might have felt easier to interpret. Instead, she simply looked at him with steady eyes that carried no trace of guilt. "Did you put that bracelet in your purse?" he asked. The question landed in the air between them with painful clarity. Alana did not answer immediately. For a brief moment, she simply studied his face, as if searching for the man she thought she knew. Then she said, "No," one word. Nothing more. Margaret folded her hands in front of her and waited. Daniel exhaled slowly. The guests watching from a distance leaned closer, drawn by the quiet tension that had replaced the earlier celebration. "Daniel," Margaret said gently, "we can handle this quietly. There is no reason for a larger scene." Her words were chosen carefully, the way someone speaks when they believe the outcome has already been decided. Daniel glanced toward the velvet pouch once more. The diamonds inside caught the chandelier light and scattered tiny reflections across the marble floor. For the first time that evening, doubt began to creep into his voice. "Alana," he said, "I need you to tell me everything." Alana nodded slowly. "I already did." And somewhere deep inside the Whitmore ballroom, a truth had begun moving quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when the carefully arranged story of that night would finally begin to crack. Daniel Whitmore had spent most of his life in rooms where every decision carried weight, but none of those moments felt as heavy as the silence now settling across the Whitmore ballroom. The crowd had shifted toward the edges of the room, forming quiet clusters near the tall windows and marble columns. No one was openly speaking anymore, but their attention had not disappeared. It had simply moved into careful observation. The kind of observation that wealthy social circles were known for, where people watched everything and remembered it later. Daniel stood between two worlds that no longer seemed capable of existing in the same space. On one side was his mother, Margaret Whitmore, composed and steady, the same woman who had taught him how reputation could shape an entire future. On the other side was Alana Brooks, standing with her shoulders straight and her voice calm, even though the entire room had just heard an accusation that could destroy her credibility in a single night. The velvet pouch still rested on the silver tray beside Margaret, the thin diamond bracelet inside, catching the light whenever someone shifted nearby. It was a small object, delicate and elegant, yet it had become the center of the entire evening. Daniel finally turned away from the tray and looked at Alana again. "Come with me," he said quietly. He gestured toward the long hallway that led away from the ballroom and toward a smaller sitting room used for private meetings during large gatherings. Alana nodded without hesitation. She did not look back at the guests or at Margaret as she followed Daniel across the polished marble floor. The soft sound of their footsteps echoed slightly in the quiet space, and as they passed through the arched doorway, the distant murmur of the crowd returned behind them like a low tide. The sitting room was smaller, lined with dark walnut shelves and framed photographs from decades of Whitmore family events. A tall window overlooked the gardens, where rows of white lanterns illuminated the lawn outside. Daniel closed the door gently behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet here felt different from the ballroom. There were no watching eyes, no whispered judgments. Only the two of them and the question that now hung between their lives. Daniel walked toward the window and placed his hands against the back of a leather chair. His reflection looked back at him faintly through the glass. He could see the tension in his own face, the tight line of his jaw that usually appeared only during high-pressure negotiations. "I need to understand what just happened," he said slowly. Alana stood a few feet away, her hands resting loosely at her sides. The calm she carried had not changed, but the softness in her eyes had faded slightly. "I already told you," she said. "I did not take that bracelet." Daniel turned toward her. "Then how did it get into your purse?" The question was not harsh, but it carried the weight of someone who needed logic in a moment that made no sense. Alana considered the room for a second before answering. Her gaze moved across the framed photographs on the walls, images of charity galas, award ceremonies, and magazine covers featuring the Whitmore name. "Your mother does not want me here," she said quietly. Daniel frowned. "That does not explain the bracelet." "It explains the reason someone would put it there," Alana replied. The sentence settled heavily in the quiet room. Daniel shook his head slightly. "You are saying my mother planted it in your purse?" "I am saying someone wanted the room to believe I took it," Alana said. Daniel walked slowly across the room until he stood only a few feet away from her. "Alana, you know what you are suggesting?" "Yes," she answered. Her voice was steady, but now there was something firmer behind it. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to resolve. "And you know what your mother believes about me." Daniel did not respond immediately. The truth was that he did know. Margaret Whitmore had never openly insulted Alana, never created open arguments or dramatic confrontations. But her disapproval had always been clear in small ways. In the careful pauses during dinner conversations. In the polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. In the repeated reminders about the importance of legacy and family reputation. "She thinks you are here because of my name," Daniel said quietly. Alana nodded once. And tonight she gave the room a reason to believe it. Outside the window, a soft breeze moved through the lanterns in the garden, causing the lights to sway slightly across the lawn. The peaceful scene felt strangely distant from the tension filling the room. Daniel rubbed his temples slowly. "My mother would not destroy a public event just to prove a point." Alana studied him for a moment before answering. "Daniel, she did not destroy the event. She controlled it." The words landed carefully but firmly. Daniel looked up again. "What do you mean?" "She waited until the room was full," Alana said. "Until everyone important was watching. Then she made the accusation in a calm voice that sounded disappointed instead of angry." Daniel's mind replayed the moment in the ballroom. The exact tone Margaret had used. The way she had paused before revealing the bracelet. The subtle shift of attention in the room. Alana continued quietly. Now everyone in that ballroom believes there was a problem with me. Even if the truth comes out later, the first story people hear is always the one they remember. Daniel leaned against the edge of the desk behind him, absorbing her words. He had built his entire career understanding perception. In business, the first narrative often defined everything that followed. But applying that logic to his own family felt almost impossible. You really believe she did this intentionally, he said. Alana met his gaze directly. I believe she wanted me gone. The honesty in her voice made the room feel even quieter. Daniel walked slowly across the floor again, stopping near the bookshelf where an old photograph of his father stood in a silver frame. He picked it up briefly before setting it back down. You know what the board would say about this situation, he said after a moment. They would say the simplest explanation is usually the truth. Alana nodded slowly. Then ask yourself something simple. Daniel looked back at her. What? Do you believe I would take something from your family in a room full of witnesses? The question was direct, leaving no space for deflection. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, then stopped. He pictured Alana laughing during quiet evenings in their apartment. He pictured the way she volunteered every Saturday morning at the Community Arts Center in Brooklyn. He pictured the way she refused expensive gifts because she said time mattered more than things. The image of her secretly slipping a diamond bracelet into her purse felt completely out of place beside those memories. And yet the bracelet had been there. Daniel exhaled slowly. I do not know what to believe right now, he admitted. Alana nodded again, but this time there was a small sadness behind her calm expression. That is the problem, she said softly. You should have known immediately. The words did not come with anger. They came with quiet disappointment. Daniel felt the meaning settle heavily between them. Outside the door, the faint sound of voices drifted from the ballroom again as guests continued discussing the evening's events. The story was already spreading through the room. And somewhere beyond the closed door, Margaret Whitmore remained exactly where she had been standing, waiting for the moment when her son would return. Daniel Whitmore stood in the quiet sitting room longer than he realized after Alana finished speaking. The lanterns outside the window continued to sway gently in the garden, casting soft reflections across the glass, but the peaceful movement felt disconnected from the tension that had settled inside the house. The words she had just spoken remained in the air between them, simple and direct. You should have known immediately. Daniel had built his life on confidence in his judgment. Investors trusted him because he made decisions quickly and stood by them without hesitation. Yet now that same instinct felt strangely unreliable. He looked at Alana again, searching her expression for any sign of uncertainty, but her face remained calm. Not defensive, not desperate, only disappointed. That quiet disappointment unsettled him more than any argument could have. He turned slightly and glanced toward the closed door that separated them from the ballroom. Even through the thick wood he could hear the distant murmur of voices. The celebration had not ended, but it had changed. The guests were still inside the house, still dressed in elegant evening clothes, still holding champagne glasses, but the story of the night was no longer the Charity Foundation or the Whitmore anniversary. It was the accusation that had just unfolded in front of them. Daniel knew how quickly stories like that traveled through the circles he lived in. By morning it would reach Manhattan boardrooms, media editors, and investors who followed every detail connected to the Whitmore name. He exhaled slowly and walked toward the door. We cannot stay in here forever, he said quietly. Alana did not move immediately. Her gaze remained steady, but there was a distance in it now that had not been there earlier in the evening. You should go back, she said. They are waiting for you. Daniel hesitated. And you? She answered without hesitation. I am leaving. The words settled into the room like a quiet final note. Daniel frowned slightly. Leaving? Yes, she said. There is no reason for me to stay in that ballroom now. He stepped closer. Running away will not solve this. Alana shook her head gently. It is not running away. It is understanding the situation. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but she continued before he could speak. Daniel, every person in that room already believes something happened tonight. Whether they think I took the bracelet or not does not matter anymore. The moment your mother made that accusation, the story began. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He knew she was right. Reputation in high society did not operate on facts alone. It moved on perception, whispers, and subtle judgments that followed people for years. Then we explain the truth, he said. Alana studied him for a moment before answering. And what truth will that be? Daniel hesitated again. The question sounded simple, but the answer was not. Because the truth required proof, and at this moment the only proof anyone had seen was the bracelet inside her purse. Alana saw the pause in his expression and gave a small, sad smile. Exactly, she said softly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck slowly. I can talk to my mother. Alana's expression did not change. You already did. In front of everyone. The memory of the ballroom returned immediately. The velvet pouch. The silence of the crowd. Margaret Whitmore's calm voice explaining what had been discovered. Daniel realized something then that made the room feel even colder. His mother had not lost control during that moment. She had remained perfectly composed, guiding the conversation in careful steps while the entire room listened. He looked down briefly before meeting Alana's eyes again. You think she planned this from the beginning? Alana did not answer with anger or accusation. She simply said, I think she wanted a reason. Daniel walked toward the desk again and placed his hands against the polished surface. The wood felt cool beneath his palms. She would not do something that could damage the company, he said quietly. The Whitmore name is attached to everything we build. Alana nodded slightly. That is why she did it carefully. Daniel looked up. Carefully. She did not accuse me of anything illegal, Alana explained calmly. She only revealed that the bracelet was found in my purse. That leaves room for everyone to form their own opinion. Daniel's mind replayed the scene again with that perspective. Margaret had never used the word theft. She had only presented the discovery and allowed the silence to do the rest. It was a subtle difference, but in rooms like theirs subtle differences carried enormous power. Alana stepped toward the window and looked out at the glowing garden lights. She knew you would have to choose what to believe, she said quietly. Daniel felt the weight of that statement immediately. You are asking me to choose between you and my mother. Alana shook her head gently. No, I am asking you to decide whether you trust me. The distinction was small but important. Daniel stood still for a long moment. In the ballroom his mother was waiting, surrounded by guests who had watched the accusation unfold. In front of him stood the woman who had just been accused of something that could destroy her reputation overnight. The house felt suddenly too quiet, as if even the walls were waiting for the next decision. Finally Daniel straightened and walked toward the door. Come with me, he said. Alana did not move. Where? Back to the ballroom. She studied his face carefully. Why? Daniel placed his hand on the door handle. Because if something was staged tonight, I want to see how far it goes. Alana looked at him for a moment longer before slowly nodding. The distance in her expression remained, but she followed him across the room. Daniel opened the door, and the sound of voices immediately returned. As they stepped back into the hallway, the atmosphere of the house felt different from earlier in the evening. Conversations lowered slightly as people noticed them returning. The tension in the air had not disappeared during their absence. If anything, it had grown stronger. At the far end of the ballroom, Margaret Whitmore still stood near the long dining table where the velvet pouch rested. She was speaking quietly with two guests, her posture as composed as ever. When she noticed Daniel and Alana re-enter the room, her conversation paused for a fraction of a second before her polite smile returned. The guests nearby turned their heads as well. The story that had begun minutes earlier was not finished, and now everyone in the room was waiting to see what the Whitmore family would do next. When Daniel Whitmore stepped back into the ballroom beside Alana Brooks, the quiet tension that had been building in the room seemed to tighten all at once. The guests had not left. If anything, they had arranged themselves more carefully around the edges of the space. Their conversation softer now, but their attention sharper. The glow of the chandeliers still washed over the marble floor and the white orchids decorating the long tables. But the celebration that had filled the house earlier in the evening had disappeared completely. What remained was anticipation. People in rooms like this understood when something important was unfolding. Daniel walked forward slowly, his posture calm but deliberate, and Alana followed beside him with the same quiet composure she had carried since the accusation. The murmur of voices faded as they crossed the floor. Near the center of the ballroom, Margaret Whitmore remained exactly where she had been standing earlier, beside the silver tray where the velvet pouch still rested. She was speaking quietly with two older guests who had been longtime supporters of the Whitmore Foundation. When she noticed Daniel approaching, she finished her sentence with polite ease and turned toward him. Her expression carried the same measured calm she always wore during public events. If anyone in the room had not witnessed what happened earlier, they might have believed the evening had continued normally. "Daniel," she said warmly as he stopped in front of her. "I was wondering when you would return." Daniel glanced briefly at the velvet pouch before meeting his mother's eyes. "We should finish this conversation," he said quietly. The two guests beside Margaret exchanged polite smiles before stepping away, understanding that the moment no longer belonged to them. Around the ballroom, several people adjusted their positions slightly, creating the subtle illusion of privacy while still remaining close enough to observe. Margaret folded her hands together in front of her. "Of course," she said calmly. "Have you spoken with her?" The way she said the word "her" carried a tone that sounded almost sympathetic. Daniel felt the weight of the question immediately. "Yes," he answered. Margaret nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something she had already expected. "And?" Daniel did not respond right away. Instead, he reached toward the silver tray and lifted the velvet pouch gently. The bracelet inside shifted with a soft sound as he held it between his fingers. The diamonds caught the light again, scattering small reflections across the polished marble floor. "You said this was found in Alana's purse," he said. Margaret's expression remained steady. "That is correct." Daniel studied the pouch for a moment before looking back at her. "Who found it?" Margaret gestured lightly toward the far side of the ballroom, where the staff members were quietly continuing their work. "One of the attendants helping with the coats," she replied. "She brought it to me immediately." Daniel followed her gaze briefly, noticing the staff member standing near the coat check area at the end of the hall. The young woman looked nervous even from across the room. Alana remained silent beside him, her attention focused on Margaret. Margaret turned slightly toward her with a composed smile. "I hope you understand that this situation is uncomfortable for everyone," she said gently. Alana met her gaze without hesitation. "I understand exactly what it is," she replied. The response was calm, but it carried a quiet strength that several nearby guests noticed immediately. Margaret tilted her head slightly, as though studying her more carefully. "Then perhaps you also understand why this cannot simply be ignored." Daniel stepped forward before the conversation could deepen further. "No one is ignoring anything," he said. Margaret looked at him with a soft expression that almost resembled concern. "Daniel, the Whitmore name carries responsibility. We cannot pretend something did not happen when it clearly did." Daniel held the pouch in his hand for another second before placing it back on the tray. "Something happened," he agreed. "But I want to understand exactly what." Margaret's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, though the change was so subtle most people in the room would not have noticed. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. Daniel glanced toward the coat check area again. "I want to speak with the staff member who found it." Margaret's smile returned quickly, though there was a faint tension behind it now. "Of course," she said smoothly. "But I am not sure what that will change." Daniel turned toward the end of the room and raised his hand slightly. The young attendant hesitated before approaching. Her steps were careful, as though she were afraid of making the situation worse. When she reached them, she lowered her gaze respectfully. "Sir," Daniel spoke gently, "you found the bracelet earlier tonight?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Margaret watched the exchange quietly, her posture unchanged. Daniel continued. "Tell me exactly what happened." The young woman took a slow breath before answering. "I was organizing the coats and handbags near the entrance. When I lifted Miss Brooks's purse, the bracelet slipped out from the side pocket." The words spread through the nearby guests like a ripple through water. Daniel listened carefully. "Did you see anyone place it there?" The attendant shook her head immediately. "No, sir. I did not see anyone." Daniel nodded once, absorbing the answer. Margaret spoke gently beside him. "As you can see, the staff member simply discovered it while doing her job." Daniel looked back at the attendant. "Did anyone touch the purse before you picked it up?" The young woman hesitated for a moment. Her eyes moved briefly toward Margaret before returning to Daniel. "There were many people arriving at that time," she said quietly. "Some guests placed their belongings there themselves." Daniel studied her expression. "Anyone specific?" She hesitated again, clearly unsure how much she should say. Margaret spoke before the pause grew longer. "Daniel, the staff cannot possibly remember every detail of the evening." Daniel turned toward his mother slowly. "Maybe not," he said, "but details matter." For the first time since the accusation began, the calm certainty in Margaret Whitmore's posture shifted slightly. It was not dramatic. It was only a brief tightening in her expression that appeared and vanished within seconds. But Alana noticed it immediately. And somewhere in the quiet tension of the Whitmore ballroom, the story that had seemed so simple only minutes earlier began to feel far more complicated. The ballroom remained suspended in a strange stillness after the attendant finished speaking. The chandeliers continued to glow above the polished marble floor, but the light now seemed sharper, almost exposing every reaction in the room. Daniel Whitmore stood quietly for a moment after hearing her answer, studying the young woman's expression carefully. She had said that she did not see anyone place the bracelet in the purse, and that many guests had moved through the coat area when people first arrived. That detail lingered in his mind. In a crowded entrance hall, dozens of hands could have passed near a single handbag without drawing attention. Margaret Whitmore watched her son with a calm patience that suggested she believed the conversation had already reached its natural conclusion. Her posture remained perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly together as she waited for Daniel to respond. Around them, the guests in the ballroom continued their quiet observation. The story unfolding in front of them had become far more interesting than the speeches and donations that had originally brought them to the Whitmore estate. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice controlled but firm. "Thank you," he said to the attendant. "You may return to your work." The young woman nodded quickly, clearly relieved that the questioning had ended. She stepped back toward the coat check area, her shoulders relaxing slightly once she moved away from the center of attention. For a few seconds no one else spoke. The faint sound of glasses touching together at the far end of the room broke the silence, though even that small noise carried a cautious tone. Daniel turned slowly toward his mother. "You see why I wanted to ask," he said. Margaret gave a small, graceful nod. "Of course," she replied. "You always prefer clarity." Daniel studied her expression carefully. She did not appear angry or defensive. If anything, she looked almost sympathetic, as though the entire situation had disappointed her more than anything else. "The staff member confirmed what we already knew," she continued. "The bracelet was discovered in Miss Brooks's purse. That is the unfortunate reality." Alana Brooks remained standing beside Daniel, her posture steady and quiet. She had not interrupted the conversation while Daniel spoke with the attendant, but now she looked toward Margaret with the same calm focus she had maintained since the accusation. "Reality can depend on how a story begins," she said softly. Several guests nearby turned their heads slightly to listen more closely. Margaret regarded her with a polite smile. "Stories do not place jewelry inside purses," she replied gently. "People do." The exchange hung in the air between them. Daniel sensed the tension building again, but this time it felt different from the earlier confrontation. Earlier, the accusation had seemed sudden and shocking. Now the room was slowly beginning to question the details behind it. Daniel stepped toward the tray again and lifted the velvet pouch once more. He held it in his hand thoughtfully, examining the delicate clasp of the bracelet inside. The diamonds were small but flawless, arranged in a narrow line that reflected the chandelier light like a ribbon of silver stars. "This bracelet has been in the Whitmore family for decades," he said quietly. "It has never once disappeared before tonight." Margaret nodded. "That is correct." Daniel looked around the room slowly, letting his gaze move across the guests who were pretending not to watch. "Which means something unusual happened tonight," he continued. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "It certainly did." Daniel returned his attention to her. "But we still do not know exactly how." Margaret's expression did not change, though the room seemed to grow even quieter as the conversation continued. "Daniel," she said calmly, "sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one." Daniel considered her words carefully. That phrase had been part of countless business discussions during his career. Investors often repeated it when analyzing complicated financial data. But he also knew that the simplest explanation was not always the true one. Sometimes it was simply the easiest story for people to accept. Alana spoke again before Daniel could respond. "Then perhaps we should look at something simple," she said. Margaret turned her attention toward her. "And what would that be?" Alana gestured lightly toward the entrance hallway where the coat check area remained visible from the ballroom. "How many people placed their belongings there tonight?" Margaret paused for a brief moment. "Many guests," she said. "That is why the staff assists with organizing them." Alana nodded slightly. "Which means anyone walking past those tables could have touched any purse or coat." The statement was obvious, Yet hearing it spoken aloud caused several guests to exchange thoughtful glances. Margaret responded smoothly. That is possible, but there is no evidence that anyone else handled your purse. Alana met her gaze without hesitation. There was no evidence that I handled the bracelet either. The calm certainty in her voice made the sentence land with quiet force. Daniel looked between the two women as the tension thickened again. He knew both of them well enough to recognize that neither one intended to retreat from the conversation. Margaret's patience was legendary in business circles, but Alana's composure carried its own strength. Finally, Daniel lowered the pouch back onto the tray. This conversation is not finished, he said quietly. Margaret nodded again. I did not expect it to be. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. Tomorrow morning, I will have the security team review the camera footage from the entrance hall. Margaret's eyes flickered briefly before her calm expression returned. The cameras are primarily for the exterior of the property, she replied. You know that? Daniel gave a small nod. Yes, but some of them cover the hallway leading to the code area. The room seemed to shift slightly as those words settled in. Cameras meant records. Records meant details that could be replayed and examined carefully. Margaret's smile remained polite, but the warmth behind it cooled almost imperceptibly. If you believe that will help, she said. Daniel glanced again toward the hallway where the attendant had returned to her duties. Then he looked back at the guests quietly observing the exchange. The evening had already taken a direction no one expected, and it was clear that no simple explanation would satisfy the questions now forming in the room. For the first time since the accusation began, Daniel realized that the truth of what happened tonight might not remain hidden for long. The quiet shift in the ballroom after Daniel mentioned the security cameras did not disappear quickly. Instead, it spread through the room like a slow ripple moving across still water. Guests who had been pretending to focus on their conversations now found it harder to maintain the illusion. Several people near the windows exchanged thoughtful glances. Others subtly checked their phones as though sending quiet messages to friends across the city. In rooms where reputation carried real power, moments like this rarely stayed contained within a single house. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the silver tray, the velvet pouch resting only a few inches from his hand. He had not touched it again since placing it back down. His attention had shifted instead toward the hallway leading to the entrance area. He knew the security system of the estate well. When his father had purchased the property decades earlier, the cameras had been installed mostly for safety, covering the driveway, the gates, and the main corridor that connected the entrance hall to the ballroom. Those cameras were not designed for family disputes, but they did record movement. And movement meant details. Margaret Whitmore watched her son carefully, though her posture remained as composed as it had been all evening. The faint tightening that had appeared in her expression earlier was gone again, replaced by the calm patience that had made her such a formidable figure in both business and social circles. Daniel, she said gently after a moment. I hope you are not planning to turn a private misunderstanding into a public investigation. Daniel looked at her slowly. If something was misunderstood tonight, the cameras will clarify it. Margaret gave a soft, almost sympathetic smile. You know as well as I do that cameras rarely show the full story. Alana Brooks stood quietly beside him, her attention fixed on Margaret. The conversation had shifted into a careful contest of words, each sentence measured, each pause meaningful. Alana noticed something in Margaret's tone that had not been present earlier in the evening. It was subtle, but it was there. A hint of caution that had replaced the earlier certainty. Daniel folded his arms loosely. They show enough. The room remained silent around them. Several guests near the center table pretended to admire the floral arrangements while clearly listening to every word. Margaret glanced briefly toward the hallway where the entrance cameras were located. The movement lasted only a second, but Daniel noticed it immediately. He had spent too many years analyzing negotiations to miss a detail like that. The evening was meant to celebrate the foundation, Margaret said calmly. It would be unfortunate if the entire event became overshadowed by unnecessary suspicion. Daniel considered her words before answering. That depends on whether the suspicion is unnecessary. Margaret's smile faded slightly. Not completely. Only enough to show that the conversation had moved into more serious territory. She stepped closer to the tray and gently adjusted the velvet pouch as though restoring order to the display. Daniel, she said softly, Sometimes protecting the family means knowing when to let a mistake fade quietly. Alana spoke before Daniel could respond. A mistake would require someone to admit making one. Margaret turned toward her again. The polite smile returned, though this time it felt thinner. Miss Brooks, I have no interest in humiliating anyone tonight. Alana met her gaze steadily. You already did. The words were spoken without anger, but the quiet truth inside them made several people near the edge of the ballroom shift uncomfortably. Daniel looked between the two women. The tension had grown stronger with each sentence, yet the conversation remained calm. That calmness made it more powerful than shouting ever could have been. Daniel finally turned toward the hallway and began walking. His steps were deliberate, not rushed, and the sound of his shoes against the marble floor echoed faintly through the ballroom. Alana followed him without hesitation. Behind them, the guests watched carefully. Margaret remained standing beside the tray for a moment longer before turning slowly and following at a measured distance. The corridor leading to the entrance hall was quieter than the ballroom. The music and voices faded behind them as they moved into the softer light of the hallway. Along the walls hung several framed photographs from earlier Whitmore charity events, each image capturing moments of applause, speeches, and elegant gatherings that had once seemed flawless. Tonight, those pictures felt strangely distant from the tension moving through the house. Daniel stopped beneath one of the security cameras mounted high near the ceiling. The small black lens pointed toward the coat check area where guests had placed their belongings when they arrived earlier in the evening. The tables there were still covered with coats, handbags, and scarves arranged neatly by the staff. Daniel looked up at the camera for a moment before turning toward the hallway leading to the estate office. The system records continuously during events, he said quietly. The footage from tonight will already be saved. Margaret stopped a few steps behind him. Daniel, she said calmly, you are treating this as if it were a criminal matter. Daniel turned back toward her. I am treating it as a matter of truth. Alana stood beside him, watching Margaret closely. Margaret's expression remained composed, but there was a pause before she responded. And if the cameras show nothing unusual? She asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. Then we will know exactly where things stand. Margaret studied her son for a long moment. The quiet hallway seemed even narrower now, the air heavier with unspoken tension. Finally, she gave a slow nod. Very well, she said. If that is what you believe is necessary. Daniel glanced once more toward the camera above them. Somewhere inside the estate security system, the events of the evening had already been captured frame by frame. Guests arriving. Staff organizing belongings. Hands placing purses and coats onto the long table. Small movements that no one had noticed at the time. Now those moments held the potential to answer the question that had divided the room. And as the three of them stood beneath the silent lens of the camera, it became clear that the truth of the evening was no longer something that could be guided by careful words alone. The hallway beneath the security camera felt colder than the ballroom behind them, though the temperature had not changed. It was the kind of cold that came from anticipation, from the quiet understanding that something hidden might soon come into the light. Daniel Whitmore stood still for a moment beneath the small black lens mounted near the ceiling, his gaze fixed on it, as though it were already revealing its secrets. The camera did not move. It simply watched, the same way it had watched every guest arriving earlier that evening. Alana Brooks stood beside him with her arms relaxed at her sides, her calm presence unchanged even though the entire direction of the night now depended on what that silent device might have recorded. Margaret Whitmore remained a few steps behind them, her posture still elegant and composed, but the distance between her and the other two felt more deliberate than before. The corridor stretched quietly toward the entrance hall, where the coat tables were arranged beneath warm, overhead lights. Beyond that hallway, the distant murmur of the ballroom continued, a reminder that dozens of people were waiting to see how the evening would unfold. Daniel finally turned away from the camera and began walking toward the office at the end of the corridor where the estate security monitors were located. The door to the office stood closed, but a faint light could be seen beneath it. The estate manager, Thomas Green, was likely still inside reviewing event logistics as he often did during large gatherings. Daniel reached the door and knocked once before opening it. Thomas looked up immediately from the desk, where several computer monitors glowed softly. He had worked for the Whitmore family for more than 20 years, and understood the rhythm of their events better than most people in the house. The moment he saw Daniel's expression, he straightened in his chair. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "is everything all right?" Daniel stepped into the room, followed by Alana, and then Margaret. The small office suddenly felt crowded. "Thomas," Daniel said calmly, "I need to review the security footage from the entrance hall earlier this evening." Thomas glanced briefly toward Margaret before returning his attention to Daniel. "Of course, sir." He turned toward the computer and began navigating through the security system. Several small screens filled the wall above the desk, each displaying a different angle of the estate grounds and interior corridors. One of those screens showed the hallway leading directly to the coat check tables. The timestamp in the corner continued to move forward steadily. Thomas typed a few commands, and the footage began rewinding, the images moving backward through time. Guests appeared on the screen walking in reverse, stepping away from the entrance as if the evening were unfolding backward. Daniel watched quietly. The small office hummed softly with the sound of the computers. Margaret stood behind him with her hands folded neatly together, her face calm though her eyes remained focused on the screen. Alana leaned slightly against the edge of the desk, her gaze steady as the footage continued to rewind toward the moment guests first arrived. Finally, Thomas stopped the video. "This was about 30 minutes before the accusation," he said. The screen showed the entrance hallway exactly as it had appeared earlier in the evening. Staff members were arranging coats while guests placed their belongings on the tables before moving toward the ballroom. Daniel stepped closer to the monitor. "Play it forward slowly." Thomas nodded and pressed a key. The video began moving again. Guests appeared one by one, entering through the main doors. Some handed their coats to the attendants while others placed purses and bags on the long table themselves. The movement was constant but orderly. Daniel watched every detail carefully. A man in a gray suit placed his briefcase down before picking it up again and walking away. A couple laughed as they removed their coats. A group of 3 women set their handbags beside each other before following the staff member toward the ballroom. Time passed slowly on the screen. Alana eventually appeared in the frame, walking beside Daniel as they arrived earlier that evening. She placed her purse gently on the edge of the table before following him toward the ballroom entrance. Daniel felt the moment tighten in his chest as he watched their earlier selves disappear down the hallway. "Pause," he said. Thomas froze the image. The purse remained visible on the table exactly where Alana had left it. Several other bags and coats surrounded it. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. "Now continue." The video resumed. Guests continued arriving, placing belongings down before entering the ballroom. Nothing seemed unusual at first. People passed by the table naturally, sometimes brushing past the items while speaking with friends or greeting the staff. The movement felt ordinary. Then Margaret Whitmore appeared on the screen. She entered through the hallway from the ballroom side, speaking briefly with one of the attendants. Daniel watched closely. Margaret walked toward the coat table with the same graceful composure she always carried during events. For a moment, she simply stood there, adjusting one of the coats that had been placed too close to the edge. Thomas slowed the footage further. The small office grew very quiet. On the screen, Margaret's hand moved across the table, brushing lightly against several purses as she straightened the arrangement. Then, almost casually, she paused beside one particular bag, Alana's purse. Daniel felt his breath slow as the image unfolded. Margaret's hand remained near the purse for a moment longer than the others. Then the video showed her placing something small onto the table beside it. The object was difficult to see clearly from the camera angle, but the movement was unmistakable. She opened the side pocket of the purse and slipped the object inside before closing it again with a smooth, practiced motion. The footage continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Margaret stepped away from the table and walked calmly back toward the ballroom entrance. In the office, no one spoke for several seconds. The quiet hum of the computers seemed louder now. Daniel remained staring at the frozen screen where the purse sat exactly as it had before the bracelet was discovered. Finally, Thomas looked toward him slowly. "Sir," Daniel raised a hand slightly, stopping him before he finished the sentence. Margaret Whitmore still stood behind him in the office, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass of the monitor. For the first time that evening, the calm certainty she had carried into the ballroom no longer controlled the story. For several seconds, inside the small security office, no one moved. The footage on the monitor remained frozen on the frame where Margaret Whitmore's hand hovered near the side pocket of Alana's purse. The diamonds of the bracelet were not clearly visible in that exact moment, but the motion itself was unmistakable. Daniel Whitmore stood only a few feet from the screen, his shoulders completely still, his eyes locked on the image as though the pixels themselves had suddenly become heavier. The quiet hum of the computers filled the room, and somewhere down the corridor the distant murmur of the ballroom continued, unaware that the entire story of the evening had just shifted direction. Thomas Green slowly leaned back in his chair, his face pale with confusion. He had served the Whitmore family for decades and had never witnessed anything like this before. He glanced once toward Daniel, and then quickly lowered his eyes again, uncertain whether he should remain in the room at all. Alana Brooks did not speak either. She stood near the desk with her arms resting lightly against the polished wood, her gaze fixed on the monitor with the same calm focus she had carried since the accusation began. But now that calm was different. The quiet weight she had been carrying all evening had finally begun to lift. The truth had appeared not through argument or explanation, but through a simple recorded moment that could not be denied. Behind Daniel, Margaret Whitmore remained standing near the doorway of the office. For the first time since the beginning of the evening, the composed certainty that had defined her presence was gone. She did not gasp. She did not protest. She simply watched the screen in silence. The reflection of the frozen frame glowed faintly across her face. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Play it again." Thomas hesitated for only a second before pressing the key. The video resumed from several seconds earlier. Once again Margaret appeared on the screen, entering the hallway from the ballroom. She spoke briefly to the attendant, stepped toward the coat table, and adjusted one of the coats near the edge. Then the moment came again. Her hand moved toward the purse. She paused. She slipped the small object inside the side pocket with a smooth and practiced motion before closing it again. The video continued for several more seconds until she turned and walked calmly back toward the ballroom as though nothing unusual had occurred. Thomas stopped the playback. The screen returned to stillness. Daniel remained facing the monitor. The silence in the room had grown so deep that even the faint ticking of the office wall clock seemed loud. Finally, he turned slowly toward his mother. Margaret Whitmore did not immediately meet his eyes. Instead, she looked briefly at the desk, then at the security screen again before lifting her gaze. The expression on her face was not panic. It was something more controlled, more complicated. A calculation that had been interrupted. Daniel studied her carefully. The woman standing in front of him had shaped his entire life. She had built Whitmore Capital with discipline and precision after his father died. She had taught him how power worked, how reputation could build empires or destroy them. Yet now the same woman had placed a family heirloom into another person's purse and allowed an accusation to unfold in front of a room full of witnesses. "Why?" Daniel asked quietly. The single word filled the office more heavily than any accusation could have. Margaret inhaled slowly before answering. "Daniel, the situation is not as simple as it appears." Daniel did not move. It looked very simple on the screen. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, clearly uncomfortable being present for a conversation this personal. Margaret noticed his presence as well and spoke calmly. "Thomas, you may step outside for a moment." Thomas stood immediately, grateful for the instruction, and quietly left the office, closing the door behind him. Now only 3 people remained in the room. Daniel, Alana, and Margaret. The monitor still displayed the frozen image of the hallway. Margaret folded her hands together slowly, the same composed gesture she had used earlier in the ballroom. "I needed you to see something tonight," she said carefully. Daniel frowned slightly. "I saw exactly what happened." Margaret shook her head once. "No, you saw a moment, not the reason behind it." Alana finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "The reason does not change the action." Margaret turned toward her with a measured expression. "Miss Brooks, you may believe that." Alana met her gaze steadily. "I know it." Daniel stepped closer to his mother. "You stood in front of an entire room and implied she stole from our family." Margaret's eyes softened slightly as she looked at him. "I implied nothing. I revealed where the bracelet was found." Daniel exhaled slowly. The careful choice of words was exactly the kind of strategy Margaret had always used in negotiations. But hearing it now felt different. "You planted it there." Margaret did not deny it. Instead, she answered with quiet certainty. Because I needed to know whether you would question it. The statement hung in the air like a new puzzle piece falling into place. Daniel stared at her. You created a public accusation just to test me? Margaret's voice remained calm. I created a situation where the truth about trust would reveal itself. Alana shook her head slowly. That is not truth. That is manipulation. Margaret did not react to the word. She simply looked back at her son. Daniel, the woman who stands beside you will share your future. Your reputation. Your company. Your family legacy. I needed to see whether you would defend her blindly or investigate the facts. Daniel stood very still. The explanation did not erase what had happened. If anything, it made the situation feel even heavier. Because the accusation had not been about a bracelet at all. It had been about power, and trust, and control. Daniel finally looked toward Alana. She had not moved, but the sadness in her eyes had returned, deeper now than before. Not because the truth had been revealed, but because the reason behind it had been exposed. The office remained quiet as the three of them stood beneath the glow of the security monitor, each understanding that the events of the evening had changed something that could never easily be repaired. Daniel Whitmore did not speak for several seconds after his mother finished explaining. The quiet office seemed smaller now, as if the air itself had grown heavier with the meaning of what had just been revealed. On the security monitor, the frozen image of the hallway still glowed softly, showing the exact moment that had changed the entire direction of the evening. Daniel looked at it again briefly, then slowly turned his attention back to Margaret Whitmore. The woman who had raised him stood only a few feet away, her posture composed as always, yet the certainty that had once made her presence unshakable now felt different. Daniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but deeper than before. You humiliated her in front of an entire room, he said. Margaret did not immediately respond. Instead, she stepped toward the desk and rested her fingertips lightly against the polished wood surface, as though grounding herself in the familiar surroundings. Daniel, she said quietly, you are looking at this only from the surface. Daniel shook his head once. There is nothing on the surface about what happened tonight. Alana Brooks remained standing beside the desk, her calm posture unchanged, though the sadness in her eyes had deepened since Margaret revealed the reason behind the scheme. She had spent the entire evening defending herself against a silent accusation, while the people around her quietly judged what they believed to be the truth. Now the truth had appeared in a glowing security frame that could not be denied. Yet instead of relief, what she felt most strongly was something heavier. Disappointment. Margaret turned toward Daniel again, her voice still composed. You believe this was about humiliating her. It was not. It was about seeing how you would respond when confronted with uncertainty. Daniel looked at her carefully. You could have spoken to me privately. Margaret gave a faint shake of her head. Private conversations rarely reveal real decisions. People answer differently when they know the room is watching. The words were spoken with quiet certainty, the same strategic thinking that had built Whitmore Capital into one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. But hearing that reasoning now felt strangely hollow. Daniel crossed his arms slowly. So you created a public accusation to watch how I reacted? Margaret nodded once. Yes. Alana's voice entered the conversation again, calm but firm. You did not just watch him. You judged me. Margaret looked toward her with measured composure. I evaluated the situation. Alana held her gaze steadily. You planted evidence. The office fell silent again. Margaret did not argue the point. She simply looked back toward Daniel. And now you know something important. Daniel frowned slightly. What exactly do you think I learned tonight? Margaret answered without hesitation. Whether you would. Question what you saw. Daniel stared at her for a moment before responding. I questioned it because it did not make sense. Margaret nodded slowly. Exactly. Alana shook her head quietly. Trust should not require a test like that. Margaret's eyes shifted briefly toward her before returning to Daniel. Trust is not the same thing as loyalty, she said. Loyalty can blind a person. Trust requires clarity. Daniel walked slowly across the office and stopped beside the security monitor again. The frozen image still displayed the hallway and the coat table, the exact place where the bracelet had been slipped into the purse earlier in the evening. The sight of it made something inside his chest tighten again. What you call clarity, he said quietly, looked like betrayal. Margaret did not respond immediately. For the first time that evening, Her gaze moved away from her son and rested briefly on the security screen. The reflection of the hallway lights flickered faintly across her face. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. Daniel, you have spent your entire life preparing to lead this family and the company that carries our name. Every decision you make will affect thousands of people. Investors, employees, partners. You cannot afford to trust someone without understanding how they respond under pressure. Daniel turned toward her. Alana was under pressure because you created it. Margaret did not deny the statement. Yes. The honesty of the answer made the room feel even quieter. Alana stepped away from the desk and moved closer to the door. She had listened to every explanation carefully, but the more Margaret spoke, the clearer the situation became. This had never been about a bracelet. It had never been about theft. It had been about control. She spoke calmly, though the words carried a quiet finality. Mrs. Whitmore, your test revealed something after all. Margaret looked toward her. And what is that? Alana met her gaze directly. That you do not trust anyone who stands beside your son. The statement hung in the air like a simple truth that could not be softened by careful phrasing. Daniel glanced toward Alana quickly. Margaret remained still for a moment before replying. I trust people who prove they belong in this family. Alana nodded slowly. Then tonight you proved something else. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. What is that? Alana's voice remained steady. That belonging. Here comes with a cost. Daniel felt the meaning of her words immediately. He looked from Alana to his mother, realizing that the moment had grown far larger than a simple misunderstanding at a charity event. Something deeper had been exposed tonight. Something that had always existed quietly beneath the surface of their lives. Margaret folded her hands together again. Daniel, she said gently, the guests in the ballroom are waiting. Daniel glanced toward the closed office door. Beyond it, the distant murmur of voices continued, a reminder that the evening had not ended. Yes, he said quietly. Margaret stepped toward the door as if the matter had already reached its conclusion. We should return before the situation becomes more noticeable. But before she could open it, Alana spoke again. I am not returning to that room. Both Daniel and Margaret turned toward her. Alana's posture remained calm, but the quiet resolve in her expression was unmistakable. I have already stood in that ballroom once tonight, while people believed something untrue about me, she said softly. I will not do it again. The words were not angry. They were simply clear. Daniel watched her carefully, realizing that the events of the evening had already changed something important between all three of them. And the conversation that had begun with a bracelet was no longer about jewelry or accusations at all. It was about whether trust could exist in a place where it had been deliberately tested. The quiet office remained filled with tension after Alana Brooks spoke those final words. I will not do it again. The statement did not echo loudly, yet it carried a weight that seemed to settle into every corner of the room. Daniel Whitmore stood near the security monitor, the frozen image of the hallway still glowing faintly across the screen behind him. Margaret Whitmore remained by the door with one hand resting lightly on the brass handle, her composed posture unchanged, yet the direction of the evening had clearly shifted in a way she had not anticipated. For several seconds none of them moved. The distant sound of the ballroom returned faintly through the walls. Glasses clinked somewhere. A short ripple of laughter followed. The guests inside still believed they were attending a polished Whitmore event, though whispers about the earlier accusation had already begun spreading quietly through the room. Daniel finally looked toward Alana. The sadness in her expression had not faded, but there was something else in her eyes now as well. Resolution. Not the kind born from anger, but from clarity. She had reached a point where the evening no longer needed explanation. The truth had already revealed itself, and what remained was a question of dignity. Daniel walked slowly toward her. Alana, he said quietly. She looked at him, but did not step closer. You do not need to go through that room again, he continued. Not alone. Margaret's voice entered the conversation calmly from near the door. Daniel, the guests are waiting. Whatever conversation remains between us can happen later. Daniel turned his head toward his mother. No, he said. It cannot. Margaret studied him carefully. You are letting emotion guide this moment. Daniel shook his head slowly. I am letting truth guide it. The quiet certainty in his voice caused Margaret to pause for a fraction of a second. She had raised him to speak with confidence, to control the tone of every negotiation and every conversation. Hearing that same confidence directed at her felt unfamiliar. Daniel continued speaking, his tone calm but firm. You stood in front of that room and allowed them to believe something about her that was not true. Margaret answered evenly. I allowed them to see what appeared to be true. Alana stepped slightly closer to the door. And you planned every second of it. Margaret did not deny the statement. Instead, she looked directly at Daniel again. What matters now is how you move forward. Daniel considered her words for a moment before responding. You are right about one thing. Margaret raised her eyebrows slightly. Which is? Daniel turned and gestured toward the security monitor behind him. The truth reveals character. The statement lingered between them. Margaret watched him carefully, her posture still dignified though the calm authority she carried earlier in the evening had begun to shift. Daniel, she said quietly. The Whitmore name does not survive on sentiment. Daniel's voice remained steady. It survives on integrity. Alana watched the exchange in silence. For the first time since the accusation began, Daniel was no longer standing between two positions trying to interpret them. He had chosen a direction. The decision did not come with anger or raised voices. It came with something quieter. Conviction. Daniel walked toward the door where Margaret stood. For a moment, neither of them moved aside. Mother and son faced each other in the narrow space of the office doorway, both aware that the conversation they were having would not end with the evening. Finally, Margaret stepped slightly to the side. Daniel opened the door. The sound of the ballroom returned more clearly now as warm light spilled into the hallway. Guests moved across the marble floor, speaking in small groups, pretending the earlier tension had faded. When Daniel stepped into the corridor beside Alana, several heads turned immediately. Word traveled quickly in rooms like this, and people sensed that something important had just happened behind the closed office door. Margaret followed a few steps behind them, but did not move forward immediately. She remained near the hallway entrance, watching quietly. Daniel and Alana walked back toward the ballroom entrance. The same chandeliers that had illuminated the earlier accusation now cast their golden light across the room again. Conversations softened as Daniel entered. Several guests paused mid-sentence. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Daniel Whitmore was not simply the host of the evening. He was the man whose name defined the gathering. He stopped near the center of the ballroom, and Alana remained beside him. Margaret stayed near the corridor entrance, observing the room carefully. Daniel looked around slowly, meeting the eyes of several guests who had witnessed the earlier scene. The quiet murmurs gradually faded until the ballroom grew still again. Daniel spoke calmly but clearly so that the people nearest him could hear. Earlier this evening there was confusion involving a piece of family jewelry. The guests listened carefully. Daniel continued. I have now reviewed the security footage from the entrance hallway. A ripple of attention moved through the room. Margaret remained motionless near the hallway entrance, her expression controlled though her eyes followed every movement in the room. Daniel looked toward Alana briefly before continuing. The footage confirmed that Alana Brooks did not place that bracelet in her purse. The room grew completely silent. A few guests exchanged quick glances. Others lowered their eyes slightly, realizing the implication of what had just been revealed. Daniel's voice remained calm but steady. The situation tonight was created by a misunderstanding that I allowed to unfold longer than it should have. He paused briefly before finishing. And for that, I take responsibility. The weight of those words settled across the ballroom. Alana stood quietly beside him, saying nothing, yet the dignity in her posture spoke louder than any explanation could have. Across the room, Margaret Whitmore remained near the hallway, her expression composed though the direction of the evening had shifted beyond the control she once held. In the center of the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore had made his decision clear, and the story of the night no longer belonged to the accusation that had begun it. The silence that followed Daniel Whitmore's announcement lingered across the ballroom long after his voice faded. The chandeliers above continued to glow warmly, casting soft light over the marble floor and the rows of white orchids decorating the tables, yet the mood of the room had shifted completely. Guests who only minutes earlier had quietly judged what they believed to be the truth now stood motionless, the weight of Daniel's words settling into their understanding of the evening. Several people lowered their eyes toward their glasses while others exchanged quiet glances, recognizing the dignity with which Alana Brooks had endured the accusation that had been directed at her. Daniel remained standing beside her near the center of the ballroom. His posture was steady, but the seriousness in his expression had not faded. He had clarified the truth, yet the deeper reality of what had happened still lingered in the air between the guests and the Whitmore family. Alana stood calmly beside him, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze composed. She had not spoken a word since Daniel addressed the room, but her silence carried its own strength. For most of the evening, she had been the subject of quiet speculation and whispered conclusions. Now the truth had reversed that narrative without her needing to defend herself again. Near the entrance to the corridor, Margaret Whitmore remained standing where she had paused earlier. From across the room her presence was still dignified and controlled, but the authority that once filled the ballroom had shifted. The guests had heard Daniel's statement. They had understood what it implied, even though he had spoken carefully. And they had seen Alana remain steady through every moment of the ordeal. Daniel glanced briefly toward Margaret, then back toward the guests surrounding him. He understood that the evening could not simply continue as if nothing had happened. Reputation in rooms like this depended not only on what was said, but on what was done next. He spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "I appreciate everyone's patience tonight," he said. "This gathering was meant to celebrate the Whitmore Foundation and the work it supports. I do not want the evening to end with confusion or discomfort." Several guests nodded quietly. The tension in the room had begun to soften slightly now that the truth had been spoken openly. Daniel continued, "Alana Brooks is someone I respect deeply. The situation earlier this evening should never have placed her in a position where her character was questioned." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Across the ballroom, a few guests offered quiet expressions of agreement. One woman, near the window, lifted her glass slightly toward Alana in a silent gesture of respect. Alana noticed the gesture but did not react dramatically. She simply inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the moment without drawing attention to it. Daniel then looked again toward the corridor entrance where Margaret remained. The distance between them felt larger than the few yards separating the two sides of the room. Margaret watched him carefully. She had always understood the language of public rooms, and she could see clearly how the atmosphere had changed. The accusation she had orchestrated had dissolved, replaced by something she had not predicted: respect for the woman she had attempted to test. Daniel spoke once more, addressing the room. "Tonight reminded me that truth matters more than assumption. And it reminded me that integrity is something we protect not only in business, but in our personal lives as well." The guests listened quietly. In circles where influence and reputation defined everything, a statement like that carried meaning beyond the immediate situation. Daniel allowed a brief pause before continuing. "I hope everyone here will continue enjoying the evening and supporting the Foundation's mission." The tension in the room began to dissolve gradually after those words. Conversations resumed in careful tones. A few guests stepped toward the refreshment tables again, while others quietly approached one another to discuss what had just unfolded. The elegant atmosphere of the event slowly returned, though the story of the evening would undoubtedly travel beyond the walls of the Whitmore estate before the night was over. Daniel turned slightly toward Alana once the attention of the room shifted away from them. His voice softened when he spoke. "You should not have had to go through that." Alana looked at him calmly. "But I did." Daniel nodded once, accepting the truth in her answer. For a moment neither of them spoke. The music from the quartet resumed softly near the far side of the ballroom, the gentle melody gradually restoring the elegant rhythm of the event. Margaret Whitmore finally began walking toward them. Her steps were measured, her posture still composed, though the room now watched her with a different awareness. When she reached them, she stopped a short distance away. For several seconds she said nothing, her eyes resting first on Daniel and then on Alana. Finally she spoke quietly. "Miss Brooks." Alana met her gaze calmly. Margaret paused before continuing. "Tonight did not unfold the way I intended." The statement was simple, yet hearing it spoken in front of the room carried significance. Alana did not respond immediately. Margaret's voice remained steady as she finished her thought. "I regret that you were placed in a situation that questioned your integrity." The apology was not dramatic or emotional. It was measured and deliberate, the kind of acknowledgement that carried meaning precisely because Margaret Whitmore rarely offered one. Alana considered her words carefully before replying. "Integrity does not disappear because someone questions it. Margaret held her gaze for a moment longer before nodding slightly. The exchange was brief, but the respect between the two women had shifted in a way that everyone nearby could sense. Daniel watched both of them quietly, understanding that the evening had revealed something about each person standing in that room. Margaret had tested control. Alana had demonstrated dignity, and the guests surrounding them had witnessed the difference between the two. As the music continued and the conversations of the ballroom slowly returned to their earlier rhythm, the truth of the evening remained quietly present beneath the elegant surface of the Whitmore gathering. The music from the string quartet flowed gently through the Whitmore ballroom as the evening slowly returned to its elegant rhythm. Conversations resumed in small circles beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, yet the events that had unfolded earlier had left a quiet imprint on everyone present. In rooms like this, people rarely spoke openly about what they had witnessed, but the memory of the moment lingered in the way guests looked at one another and in the respectful space that now seemed to surround Alana Brooks whenever she moved through the room. Daniel Whitmore stood beside her near the tall windows overlooking the garden, where rows of lanterns cast soft light across the manicured lawn. The tension that had filled the estate earlier had eased, yet something deeper had shifted in the air between them. Daniel looked toward Alana for a moment before speaking quietly. "You handled tonight with more grace than anyone could have expected." Alana rested her hand lightly against the glass window and watched the lanterns sway outside in the night breeze. "Grace was the only thing I had left," she said calmly. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the meaning behind her words. For hours she had been placed at the center of a situation she had not created, judged silently by people who believed they understood the truth. Yet she had never raised her voice, never allowed anger to control the moment. The strength she showed had not been loud. It had been steady. Daniel's voice softened as he continued. "I should have stopped it sooner." Alana turned toward him gently. "You stopped it when you knew the truth." Daniel held her gaze for a moment before responding. "I should have trusted you before that." The quiet honesty in his words carried more weight than any apology spoken earlier in the evening. Alana studied him carefully, searching his expression not for regret, but for understanding. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Trust grows in moments like this," she said softly. Across the ballroom, Margaret Whitmore stood near one of the long tables where several guests had gathered to discuss the foundation's work. From a distance, she appeared exactly as she always had during public events. Elegant, composed, commanding quiet respect. Yet even she understood that something about the evening had altered the balance she had always controlled so carefully. Margaret glanced briefly toward Daniel and Alana by the window. She had built her life on strategy and foresight, yet tonight she had learned something that could not be measured by control alone. Some forms of strength did not come from power. They came from restraint. The quartet continued playing softly as the evening moved forward. A few guests approached Daniel to express their support for the foundation and to compliment the handling of the unexpected situation earlier. Each conversation was polite and measured, but Daniel sensed the deeper message behind their words. They had seen how he responded when the truth became clear. Reputation in rooms like this was shaped by moments of pressure, and the guests would remember how the Whitmore name had chosen integrity over silence. After several minutes, Daniel returned to the window where Alana still stood watching the garden lights. "Some of the board members want to meet next week about expanding the scholarship program," he said quietly. "They believe the foundation could reach twice as many students if we increase the endowment." Alana smiled faintly. "That sounds like the kind of conversation tonight was supposed to inspire." Daniel returned the smile, though his expression remained thoughtful. "It will." A short silence followed as they watched the lanterns sway across the lawn. The estate had been filled with tension earlier, yet the calm that now surrounded them felt more genuine than the polished elegance that had begun the evening. Daniel finally spoke again. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that tonight made something clear to me." Alana looked toward him. "What is that?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "You belong here because of who you are, not because of my name or my family." The sincerity in his voice made the words feel simple and undeniable. Alana's expression softened slightly. "Belonging is not something a room decides," she replied quietly. "It is something two people build." Daniel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The evening had exposed more than a test of loyalty or a misunderstanding about a bracelet. It had revealed how easily power could attempt to shape truth, and how quietly dignity could stand against it. Near the entrance of the ballroom, Margaret Whitmore spoke with one of the foundation donors, her voice calm and steady as she discussed the education initiatives the organization supported. Yet, even as she continued her conversation, her thoughts returned briefly to the moment she had witnessed earlier when Daniel stood before the guests and chose to defend someone whose strength she had underestimated. Margaret had spent her life believing that control ensured success. Tonight had reminded her that respect often came from something else entirely. The music shifted into a softer melody as the evening approached its final hour. Several guests began gathering their coats, while others moved toward the garden terrace to enjoy the night air. The Whitmore estate slowly returned to the quiet dignity it was known for. Daniel and Alana eventually stepped away from the window and joined the remaining guests near the terrace doors. The foundation volunteers spoke excitedly about future programs and new partnerships that might grow from the night's gathering. Life moved forward the way it always did after moments of tension had passed. Yet the truth revealed that evening remained quietly present in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Not because it had been dramatic or loud, but because it had been clear. In a room where assumptions had briefly overshadowed reality, the truth had appeared calmly and without apology. And the woman who had endured the accusation had never needed to raise her voice to prove who she was.